A corn mill has existed on, or close to, the site of Heron Corn Mill since 1096. Manorial corn mills were first introduced by the Normans upon their conquest in 1066. New laws demanded that all grain grown on a lord's estate must be ground by the landowner's mill and paid for by a toll or multure. This measure, known as the milling soak, ended a long Anglo-Saxon tradition where every household ground its own corn. Household millstones were seized and destroyed, and the centralised mill became a focus of villagers' resentment. At this time, the mill at Beetham lay in the manor of Haverbrack and was called Haverbrack Mill. Documents show that in 1220 the lord of the manor gave the monks of St Mary's of York the right to grind their grain without multure. Through a series of gifts in the 13th century to Conishead Priory, the mill came increasingly under monastic control. After the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536, mills became the property of the king and were now called King's Mills. Many were sold off to swell the royal coffers, including the mill at Beetham. During the 16th century, Haverbrack Mill was handed down through various wills and inheritances. It was first recorded as Heron Mill in 1608 and was thought to be named after a nearby heronry a mile to the north. In 1645, the mill was bought by Edward Wilson, the owner of Dalham Estate, and remained in the Wilson family for 300 years. The current mill buildings are thought to have been built around 1740 by Edward Wilson's son, Daniel. This mid-18th century mill was built to house a rail louder frame with its internal water wheel, a wooden mill race, and integral grain kiln. By the late 18th century, there were two mills, one on each side of the river, and the water rights were divided between them. The Industrial Revolution was hungry for water power, and many corn mills were adapted for other industrial purposes. In 1788, the mill opposite Heron Mill was converted to a paper mill and remains as such to this day. In 1849, a new iron water wheel was installed, and this is the one you see today. By the end of the 19th century, Heron Corn Mill was still grinding between 80 and 90 tonnes of flour a week. That's equivalent to around 12,000 loaves a day. During this period, cheaper wheat was being imported from North America, Australia and Russia, and milled in large factories at the dockside. Small country mills could no longer compete, and many local mills closed. Heron Corn Mill survived by gradually switching production from milling flour to grinding grain for animal feed. In 1927, the mill was leased by the Lancaster firm of W&J Pye, specifically to grind animal feed.
Jim Wilson was working at Heron Mill when it ground its last.
The milling farmers' grain and most of the stuff producing for cattle foods, and the farmers' own grain, which used to come to the mill to have it processed for their pigs and cattle.
It's a real old-fashioned water mill, isn't it?
Oh, it's real old.
And it worked
one, yeah.
entirely off the water power?
Yes, yes. We had a second little water wheel attached to it, which used to drive a generator producing the electric light. If anything went wrong with that, well, that was just too bad. We were without light.
Production finally ceased in 1958, bringing to an end 900 years of milling at Beetham. Management of the mill returned to the Dalham estate, and the buildings were used for storage by local farmers, and gradually fell into disrepair. The mill was subsequently purchased by Henry Cook Limited in order to obtain full water rights for its paper-making business on the opposite bank. Henry Cook Limited leased the mill to the newly formed Beetham Trust in 1973.
So I wonder what your first reactions were when you came to do the study on the mill.
One of complete enthusiasm. I walked through the door at first floor level and immediately realized that this should be preserved at all costs. The very nature of the woodwork supporting the millstones, the so-called Hurst frame. There's an element of uniqueness in that really justifies its preservation. And the moment I saw that, I realized one must go, one could say, hell for leather to get it preserved.
The renovated mill was opened to the public by Princess Alexandra in 1975. The Associated Barn is thought to be contemporary to the mill building. Originally a threshing barn, it was restored and developed as a museum of papermaking in 1988. This better reflected the history of the paper mill on the opposite bank, so in 2008 the barn underwent redevelopment. It now provides a community space for arts and educational events throughout the year. In 1990, the Environment Agency constructed a fish pass that travels up through the naturally formed cave between the mill and the barn. This allows salmon and trout to reach breeding grounds higher up the river. Fish can be seen jumping the stone steps between September and December. Whilst the traditional method of power production has been maintained, the Trust has also embraced new technology. In 2009, the turbine house was constructed. It houses a 100 kilowatt Kaplan hydropower turbine. The turbine, just like the 19th century water wheel, is driven solely by the River Beela's flow. The turbine provides the mill with electricity, as well as an income from the excess that it sells to the paper mill. Extensive renovations to the fabric of the mill were carried out during the summer of 2013 with the aid of a Heritage Lottery grant. The building was re-roofed using local slate. The cementitious mortar from the 70s was painstakingly removed and replaced with lime mortar. The interiors were stripped back to the brickwork and repainted in traditional lime wash, and the timber and windows repaired or replaced. By preserving the 18th century buildings and machinery, the Trust has preserved its history. With the introduction of modern technology and a focus on arts and education, it has secured its future. Once an essential part of medieval village life, the mill site is now a unique visitor centre. And at its heart is the River Beela. The natural weir continues to power the ancient water wheel, turning the stones, grinding the corn, and now pushing the propellers of the modern turbine.